My name is Riley Dawson. I'm 34 years old, and I currently live in a quiet, unassuming apartment about 20 minutes from the street where I grew up. If you walked into my place right now, you wouldn't see much in the way of luxury. My furniture is secondhand. I drive a car that's just hoping to see another 50,000 miles, and I haven't taken a real vacation since my mid-20s. There's a very specific, very expensive reason for that thriftiness. 4-5 agonizingly long years, I funneled almost every single spare dollar I earned, every bonus, every bit of overtime pay, every tax refund, into paying off one colossal beast of a debt, the $680,000 mortgage on my parents' two-story house in Rochester, New York. $680,000. It's a number that still makes my stomach tighten when I say it out loud. For half a decade, that number defined my existence. I lived like a monk so that house wouldn't stay underwater. And the whole time I was writing those massive checks, I had this movie playing in my head about what the finish line would look like. I didn't expect a parade. I wasn't looking for a statue in the front yard. Honestly, I just pictured a quiet Tuesday evening. Maybe a simple dinner at the kitchen table where I'd done my homework growing up. I pictured my dad, Gregory, actually looking me in the eye, maybe clearing his throat and saying something like, "Riley, you saved us. We're proud of you." That was the fantasy that kept me going during double shifts. The reality arrived last month in the form of a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon. I answered, expecting the usual. Maybe my mom asking how work was before pivoting to complaints about the neighbors. Instead, it was my dad. There was no preamble. "No, how are you?" He didn't even bother with the weather. "Riley," he said, his voice flat and businesslike. "I know the mortgage is clear. We got the notice." I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. The moment. "Yeah, Dad. It is. It's finally done." There was a pause on the other end. Heavy, loaded silence. Then he dropped the bomb that obliterated 5 years of my life. "Right. Well, listen. Your mother and I have been talking. Now that the house is free and clear, we've decided we're gifting the deed to Dylan." I remember staring at the drywall in my kitchen. The phone pressed so hard against my ear it started to throb. My brain simply refused to process the sentence. Dylan. My younger brother. The golden boy who had floated through college on an endless stream of second chances, while I was working 60-hour weeks to keep the roof over their heads. "I'm sorry," I stammered, my voice sounding thin and far away. "I think I must have misheard you. You're giving the house to Dylan." Before I could spiral, my father cut right through my confusion. He wasn't done. "It's his graduation present, Riley. A real start in life. We're throwing a big celebration this weekend to hand over the keys and make the announcement to the family." Then came the second blow, the one that really knocked the wind out of me. "And listen," he added, his tone hardening. "You are not invited to the party. I don't want you bringing your attitude and ruining his big day. We want this to be a happy occasion." My mouth went completely dry. It felt like all the blood had been drained from my body. I had just bought them a nearly $750,000 asset with my own blood, sweat, and tears, and I was being told I was the problem. I was the attitude that needed to be managed. I felt a hot, stinging prickle behind my eyes. "Dad, are you serious right now? Do you have any idea what I sacrificed to pay that off? Dylan hasn't paid a utility bill in his life, and you're handing him a paid-off house." The sigh on the other end of the line was loud and performative. It was the sigh of a man dealing with a hysterical child. "Riley, stop it," he snapped. "God, why do you always have to make everything about money? It's vulgar. Family should be happy for each other. Why can't you just be happy that your brother is getting a leg up? You're always so resentful." He didn't wait for an answer. He just hung up. I sat in my cheap kitchen chair, listening to the dead silence of the disconnected line. The dial tone buzzed in my ear like an angry wasp. I looked around my small apartment, the place I lived because I couldn't afford anything better while carrying their debt, and I felt something inside me snap. It wasn't sadness. Sadness is soft. This was something hard, cold, and incredibly sharp. I sat there for a very long time, until the sun went down and the apartment turned dark. Eventually I picked up my phone again. I only made one call. I dialed the number of the only other person on this planet who knew the actual truth about where those monthly mortgage payments had come from for the last 5 years. When he answered, my voice was dead calm. "Do you want to tell them?" I asked. "Or should I?" 3 days later, my brother's big day didn't look anything like the celebration my parents had planned. But before I tell you how everything fell apart at that party, and believe me, it fell apart spectacularly, I need to ask you a favor. If you have ever felt like the invisible safety net in your own family, if you're the one who fixes everything while the credit goes elsewhere, if you've ever been told you're difficult just for asking for basic respect, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Helps more people find this story. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just family drama. It's a roadmap for what happens when the responsible child finally decides to stop staying quiet and start collecting what they're owed. You need to understand, the Riley who received that phone call wasn't built in a day. There was a time in my life when news like that would have crushed me, and I still would have swallowed the hurt, put on a fake smile and sent a card. That reflex to accommodate them, to make myself smaller so Dylan could feel bigger, was programmed into me from birth. To understand why I paid that money, and why I eventually had to burn it all down, we have to go back to that house on the quiet street in Rochester. The house that was the backdrop to every memory I have, good and bad. That house in Rochester wasn't just a building made of wood and siding. To a stranger driving past, it was nothing special. Just another faded 2-story home on a quiet street where the sidewalks cracked a little more every winter. But for me, it was the only anchor I had ever known. It was the backdrop to every scraped knee, every slammed door, every hushed late-night conversation, and every birthday candle I ever blew out. My father, Gregory Dawson, didn't just own that house. He tied his entire sense of self-worth to that roof. He ran a small auto repair shop on the edge of town, the kind of place that smelled permanently of old oil and stale coffee. He loved the idea of himself as the indispensable man, the guy who kept other families moving, the pillar of the community. He thrived on that image. But at home, the spotlight he cast only ever really shined in one direction. And it wasn't toward me. My younger brother, Dylan, was the future my dad was always talking about. Even back then, when the future was just a vague concept, the energy in the house revolved around him. If the business had a good month, Dylan got the new sneakers. If the business had a bad month, I was told to pick up extra shifts at my part-time job to cover my own school supplies. My mother, Angela, was the bridge between these two realities. She spent her life smoothing things over, cooking meals that stretched a budget that was always too tight, and paying the smaller bills while ignoring the bigger, scarier ones. Her parenting style was split down the middle. With me, the default setting was, Riley is smart, she'll figure it out. With Dylan it was, the world is hard, we need to make room for him. By the time I hit my early teens, I had learned the most important lesson of my childhood. Don't ask. If there was money for a class trip, it went to Dylan because he needs the social experience. If there was enough cash for a new winter coat, he got it first because he's growing so fast. It wasn't that they were cruel to me. They didn't lock me in a cupboard. It was more subtle than that. They just treated me like a fully formed adult who didn't need nurturing, and they treated Dylan like a perpetual child who needed constant buffering from reality. So I adapted. That's what kids do, we survive. I studied hard not for the praise, which rarely came, but because I knew grades were my ticket out. I took whatever under-the-table work I could find, babysitting, walking dogs, shelving books at the library, and I hoarded that money. I focused entirely on building a life that did not depend on Gregory and Angela Dawson. When I finally left for college and then eventually moved into the workforce, that pattern hardened into concrete. I took the jobs nobody else wanted. I worked holidays. I finally landed a position that paid enough to let me breathe, but I didn't lifestyle creep. I rented small, drafty apartments. I drove used cars that rattled on the highway. Cooked rice and beans at home. I told myself that this independence, This ability to stand on my own 2 feet without asking anyone for a dime was worth more than any help my family might have offered. But while I was building my fortress of solitude, back in Rochester, the foundation of my parents' life was cracking. My father's shop started to struggle. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow leak. The industry changed, cars became more computerized, and he didn't want to invest in the new diagnostic tech. Business slowed. Then, one costly repair on his own equipment wiped out 2 months of profit. A particularly brutal New York winter pushed customers to delay anything that wasn't an emergency. The mortgage, which had always been a stretch, slipped behind. Then it slipped again. Late fees started stacking up like snowdrifts against the back door. My parents never sat me down to explain this. They were too proud, especially my dad. He would never admit to his daughter, the one he ignored, that he was failing. But I could hear the strain creeping into their voices whenever I called. My mom sounded breathless, anxious. My dad sounded shorter, angrier at the world. The truth came out during a visit home about 5 years ago. I had driven up for the weekend, just a routine check-in. I was in the kitchen, looking for a bottle opener, and I opened the junk drawer. Everyone has one. It's usually full of rubber bands and batteries. This one was full of envelopes. A thick, disorganized stack of them, all bearing the distinct red logo of the bank. None of them had been opened. I remember standing there, the kitchen humming with the sound of the refrigerator, holding that stack of paper. My hands were trembling. I knew what this was. You don't leave bank letters unopened unless you already know what's inside and you're too terrified to look. I ripped the top one open. Final notice. Intent to foreclose. The words jumped out at me like a physical slap. I did the math quickly in my head. They weren't just a few months behind, they were drowning. They were on the verge of losing the only stable place we had ever had. In that moment I had a choice. A very clear, very distinct fork in the road. I could have closed the drawer. I could have put the letters back, driven back to my apartment, and let them face the consequences of their own mismanagement. I could have told myself, this isn't my mess. I'm the one who buys my own clothes. I'm the one who pays my own rent. Let Dylan save them. But I knew Dylan. Dylan was in college, partying on their dime, completely oblivious to the fact that the checking account was bleeding out. If I walked away, the house would go. My parents would be on the street. My dad, for all his faults, would be broken. My mom would be devastated. And despite everything, despite the favoritism, despite the neglect, I loved them. And I loved that house. It was the only place in the world that felt like home. Instead of closing the drawer, I took the stack of letters to my old bedroom. I sat on the edge of the twin bed I used to sleep in, surrounded by posters I hadn't taken down in a decade, and I pulled out my laptop. I opened a spreadsheet and I did the math. I looked at what I earned. I looked at what I spent. I looked at the horrifying number at the bottom of the foreclosure notice. It was obvious that if I stepped in, my life would stop. Not just pause, stop. If I poured a huge part of every single paycheck into that loan, there would be no vacations. There would be no new car. Promotions and raises would go into someone else's equity instead of my 401k. Trips and small luxuries, the things you work hard to enjoy, would belong to other people. I would be working just to exist. I sat there for an hour, staring at the cursor blinking on the screen. I weighed my freedom against their survival. Chose them. I walked downstairs and put the letters on the table in front of my father. He looked at them, then at me, and his face crumbled. For a split second, the arrogance was gone. He looked old. He looked scared. "I'll fix it," I said. 3 words. I didn't ask for thanks. I didn't ask for a parade. "I'll fix it." The payments started quietly. Every month, a massive chunk of money left my account and chipped away at a balance that didn't have my name at the top. My dad almost immediately pivoted his attitude. He went from scared to stoic. He started talking about holding on to the family home, as if it were his determination, his sacrifice that was doing it. He framed it as a battle he was leading. My mom thanked me in small, private ways. A favorite meal when I visited, a text message with a heart emoji saying she loved me. But she never pushed him to admit what I was really doing. She never said, "Gregory, tell her thank you." She just kept the peace. When things grew especially shaky in the beginning, a relative stepped in to make sure one bad year wouldn't wipe out my efforts. My uncle, Edward Lane, my mom's brother, was the only one who looked at the situation with cold, hard logic. He was a businessman, and he didn't trust my father's pride. Edward helped my parents sign a set of papers. He insisted on it. It was a trust arrangement. He told them, "If Riley is paying for this, we need to make sure the asset is protected from the bank and from any other creditors." My parents signed because they were desperate. They would have signed anything to stop the foreclosure. My name appeared in those pages, linked to responsibilities I was already carrying and to rights I barely thought about at the time. I wasn't trying to grab power. I wasn't trying to own them. I just wanted to make sure that the money I was throwing into this black hole actually counted for something. For a long time I believed that was enough. I told myself that just knowing my parents could sleep without wondering if a sheriff was going to padlock the door was payment enough. The days after I started sending those large payments blurred into a narrow, gray routine. Work, bills, transfers. Work, bills, transfers. I watched my friends go to Europe. I watched them buy their own condos. I stayed in my cheap apartment, eating leftovers, watching the mortgage balance shrink on a screen, and telling myself a lie. I kept telling myself that once the debt was gone, things between me and my parents would change. I convinced myself that this sacrifice was buying more than just drywall and shingles. I thought it was buying respect. I thought that when the balance hit zero, the dynamic would shift. That they would finally see me not as the invisible daughter, but as the savior of the family legacy. From my apartment window, I watched Rochester move through its seasons. Snow turned to gray slush. The trees burned orange and red before going bare again. 5 years of seasons. Each change outside matched another bank statement filed into a box under my bed. Proof that I was holding up a house I didn't live in. On weekends, I'd drive back to the old street to check in. Nothing on the surface looked different. The siding still needed paint. The front steps still creaked. But inside I felt the gap widening. My father talked more and more about how hard he was fighting to keep the place. He'd tell neighbors, "It's been a tough few years, but we're making it work." We. He never defined who we was. And my role stayed unspoken, tucked into the same dark drawer where he used to hide the bank letters. Then, Dylan's final year of college started, and everything in that house tilted toward him so violently I thought the floorboards would snap. Phone calls revolved around his classes, his stress, his plans. My mother asked if I could come to his graduation because she wanted pictures with both her children. My father started planning a party. He called it the fresh start the family needed. By then, the mortgage was almost gone. I knew exactly how many payments were left, 3, then 2, then 1. I could picture the moment the last one cleared. In my head, the scene was so simple, so warm. We would gather in the kitchen. My parents would open the final letter from the bank, the one that said, "Paid in full." The three of us would look at each other and share the same understanding of what had been saved, and exactly who had saved it. I didn't expect a speech. I didn't want a trophy. I just hoped for honesty. But as I drove toward that graduation weekend, listening to the hum of my tires on the asphalt, I had no idea that the script I had written in my head was about to be rewritten by people who had been editing me out of the story for my entire life. The day the final payment cleared, the silence was deafening. I had spent 5 years fantasizing about that specific Tuesday. I had imagined a cinematic release of tension, a collective exhale that would blow the dust off our family dynamic. But there was no kitchen scene. There was no shared relief. There was only the cold, digital fact that the loan balance on my banking app now read $0, and the sinking realization that my parents had been planning a celebration that had nothing to do with me. The silence wasn't just an absence of noise. It was an answer. It told me that to them, my sacrifice hadn't been a heroic rescue mission. It had been a utility bill. I was just the appliance that kept the lights on, and now that the house was secure, they could go back to the program they actually wanted to watch. The Dylan Show. The idea that something was deeply, structurally wrong settled in my chest like a stone. It would have been so easy to gaslight myself again. It would have been easy to say, "Riley, stop overreacting. You should be grateful they kept the house, no matter how they frame it." That was the story I had been repeating to myself for years to justify the check writing. But now, with the balance at zero, that story sounded thin. It sounded like a script someone else had written for me, and I was tired of reading my lines. I went into my closet and pulled out a dusty plastic file box. I dug past the old tax returns and found the folder with the trust documents, the ones Uncle Edward had forced my parents to sign 5 years ago. I sat on my floor and read them properly for the first time. Really read them. My name sat on those pages, black ink on white paper, tied not just to the responsibility of the debt, but to the future control of the property. The house wasn't just a vague family heirloom held together by sentimental goodwill. It was a legal entity. It was bound to agreements and conditions my father had accepted when he was desperate and shaking in his boots. That realization led me back to my Uncle Edward. Edward Lane is a man of few words. He's the kind of guy who measures twice and cuts once, and he has a low tolerance for my father's bluster. He had been the one to insist that if I was going to carry the burden, it needed to be recognized in ink. I met him for coffee, bringing the folder with me. Sitting across from him, watching him stir his black coffee, I realized something. He hadn't just protected the asset. He had been waiting for me to wake up. He had always assumed I knew how much power those papers gave me. "The mortgage is done," I told him. He nodded, his eyes sharp. And I think they're about to do something stupid." Edward didn't look surprised. He just leaned back. "The house isn't a prize your father can hand to your brother just because it suits the story he wants to tell at a party. It's an asset, Riley. It's anchored to your choices, your sacrifices, and your name. The question is, are you going to let them pretend otherwise?" I left that meeting with a sharper picture of reality than I had ever had. For the first time, I stopped planning how to keep the peace. I started considering what it would mean to stop letting other people edit me out of my own life. Graduation weekend arrived a few days later. It felt less like a milestone for my brother and more like a stress test for the family. That Friday night, I turned onto my parents' street. The transformation was immediate. The porch was wrapped in twinkling string lights. A massive vinyl banner with "Congrats Dylan" hung over the front door, flapping slightly in the breeze. From the outside, the house looked like a perfect, neat story about sacrifice paying off. It looked like the American dream. Inside, the sound hit me first. The house was packed. Relatives filled the rooms, holding paper plates of potato salad and plastic cups of cheap wine. The air was hot and loud, conversations stacking on top of one another. A few aunts and cousins hugged me in passing, surprised I had come, but their attention slid away almost immediately, like water off a duck's back. Their eyes were constantly darting around, looking for the star of the show. As I moved along the edges of the living room, hugging the wall like I used to when I was a teenager, fragments of conversation kept drifting my way. "So proud of him. Heard he's going to fix up the yard. Great that he has a place to start." People were discussing where Dylan might work, how he would set up his bachelor pad, what color he should paint the living room. The house I had been funding month after month, year after year, had already been recast as his starting point. No one questioned the premise. They were simply repeating the version my parents had fed them. My father drifted through the crowd like a king holding court. He had a drink in one hand and was retelling a polished, sanitized account of the last few years. "It was touch and go," I heard him say to a neighbor, looking solemn. "But I kept this family afloat. I worked damn hard to keep this roof over our heads. A man does what he has to do." He was stealing the grief. He was stealing the stress. He was wearing my sacrifice like a costume. My mother stayed close to him, topping off drinks, nodding at the right moments, keeping the focus exactly where he wanted it. Neither of them mentioned the bank transfers. Neither of them mentioned the daughter standing in the corner. Across the room, I locked eyes with Uncle Edward. He was leaning against the mantel, watching the room with a quiet, terrifying steadiness. He held a drink he wasn't drinking. He knew exactly what was in the folder back at my apartment. He knew my father was walking a tightrope over a canyon without a safety net. Eventually, the noise died down as my father clinked a spoon against his glass. Everyone, come in here," he bellowed, waving his arms. People squeezed onto the couch and lined the walls. The air grew thick with anticipation. Dylan stood next to my dad, looking appropriately humble but with a smirk he couldn't quite hide. My dad stood by the old fireplace, the one I had paid to have fixed 3 winters ago, and started his speech. He talked about the house as the heart of the Dawson family. He talked about weathering the hard years, about the resilience of the Dawson name. He talked about believing that his son was the torchbearer who would carry things forward. Then he dropped the hammer. "And that is why," my father said, his voice swelling with emotion, "Angela and I have decided that this home will serve as Dylan's graduation gift. The deed will be his. A debt-free foundation for his future." Applause broke out. "Cheers." Dylan beamed, shaking his head in mock disbelief. Hearing it declared in front of a room full of relatives turned the private betrayal into something heavier. It wasn't just an insult anymore. It was public policy. It was an invitation for everyone present to agree that I didn't exist. My contribution didn't matter. My 5 years of sweating bullets over bank balances were just a footnote in Dylan's biography. But the applause hadn't quite peaked when a voice cut through the room. Calm, plain, and loud enough to be heard over the cheering. "You can't do that, Gregory." The room went silent. The applause died a strangled death. Uncle Edward stepped forward from the mantel. He didn't look angry. He looked bored, which was somehow worse. "Excuse me," my father said, his smile faltering. "I said you can't do that," Edward repeated. "The house isn't an heirloom you can just hand over with a toast. You're forgetting the trust." My father's face went a shade of red I had only seen a few times. "This is a party, Ed. Don't start with the legal mumbo-jumbo." "It's not mumbo-jumbo," Edward said, his voice flat. "It's the law. That house is tied to a specific agreement. An agreement you signed when the bank was threatening to take the keys. That structure exists because someone else took on the payments." He didn't say my name. He didn't point a finger at me. But the connection was sharp enough that the air in the room changed pressure. Several pairs of eyes shifted toward me, standing by the hallway door. The someone else hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My father tried to laugh it off. "It's a technicality. We're family. We handle this as a family." "The bank doesn't care about family feelings, Gregory," Edward said. "And neither does the deed." The mood in the room curdled. The applause my father had expected never really came back. People looked at their shoes. They looked at their drinks. The triumphant narrative had hit an iceberg. My father brushed off Edward's reminder as a buzzkill moment, insisting loudly that everyone knows what I meant, and tried to restart the party. But the energy was gone. People began slipping out earlier than they might have otherwise, muttering excuses about babysitters and early mornings. I didn't stay to watch the cleanup. I caught Edward's eye one last time, gave him a small nod, and walked out the front door. I drove back to my apartment with a different kind of clarity. The sadness was gone. The longing for their approval was gone. As long as I left my story in their hands, my work would stay in the background. If any line was going to be drawn, it would have to come from me. And I knew exactly where to draw it. A few days later, I went back to the house alone. I didn't call ahead. I didn't send a warning text. I just needed to see if the reality matched the feeling in my gut. The party was over, the banner was gone, and the street had settled back into its usual Tuesday morning quiet. A neighbor was mowing their lawn 2 doors down, the smell of cut grass hanging in the humid air. It felt incredibly normal, which was jarring because my world had completely shifted on its axis. I walked up the front steps, steps I had paid to have reinforced the year prior, and pulled my keychain out of my pocket. I found the silver key, the one I'd had since I was 16. I slid it into the lock. It went in about halfway and then it hit a wall. I frowned, jiggling it slightly, thinking maybe the tumblers were just sticky. Old houses, right? I tried again. Push, jiggle, turn. Nothing. It wasn't stuck. It was wrong. I stood there for a second, my brain trying to catch up to what my hand already knew. The mechanism had been changed. That small resistance, that piece of metal refusing to turn, said what no one in my family had the guts to say to my face. It was a physical rejection. It was a silent, mechanical scream that said, "You are not welcome here." I knocked. A sharp, loud rap on the wood. A moment later the door opened. But it didn't open wide. It opened just a crack, the chain still slid into place across the gap. Dylan's face appeared in the slice of darkness. He looked tired, maybe a little hungover from the weekend, but mostly he looked guarded. He saw me and he didn't smile. He didn't open the door. "Hey," he said. Not a question. Just a noise. "The key doesn't work, Dylan," I said, holding it up. He looked at the key, then back at my eyes. He shifted his weight, and I could see stacks of moving boxes piled up in the hallway behind him. My parents were already moving his stuff in. The takeover was happening in real time. "Yeah," Dylan said, scratching the back of his neck. "Dad said it was safer to change them. You know, since the house is technically mine now. Just wanted to make sure everything was secure." Secure. From who? From the person who paid for the lock he was standing behind. He didn't need to deliver a villainous speech. The way he stayed half-hidden, the way his eyes flicked from my useless key to my expression, carried the message clearly enough. He wasn't embarrassed. He was territorially asserting himself. "Right," I said. My voice was dangerously calm. "Secure." "Look, Riley," he started, his tone dismissive. "I'm busy unpacking. Dad said we can talk later when you've cooled off." "I'm not hot, Dylan," I said. "I'm incredibly cold." He frowned, not understanding, and then he closed the door. I heard the deadbolt slide home. Blick. I stood on the porch with a key that no longer worked, staring at the painted wood, and I understood something profound. My next move couldn't be another compromise. It couldn't be a negotiation. It would have to be the beginning of a boundary my family had never expected to see. The quiet after that locked door came home with me and refused to move. It didn't feel like confusion anymore. It felt like a decision my family had made, and finally, I was seeing it without the filter of hope. I went back to my apartment and placed the useless key in the exact center of my coffee table. It sat there like an artifact. Now it was just a piece of jagged metal, a physical reminder of how much of my life I had poured into a vessel that couldn't even hold water for me. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the porch. I saw the new lock. I saw Dylan filling the doorway as if that space had always belonged to him by divine right. The warm story I had repeated to myself for 5 years, about doing the right thing, about being the good daughter, sounded thin and tired. It sounded like a lie I had told myself to survive. In the morning, I didn't go to work immediately. I pulled the storage box from under my bed again and carried it to the kitchen table. I emptied it until the surface disappeared under paper. Statements, emails, copies of mortgage notices, carbon copies of cashier's checks. All the proof that I hadn't imagined any of this. Each page marked a moment where I chose their stability over my own. Here is the month I didn't go to my friend's wedding in Mexico. Here is the month I drove on bald tires. Here is the month I ate instant noodles for 3 weeks. I added the trust documents my Uncle Edward had pushed them to sign. I read them slowly this time. Not like a daughter reading a family agreement, but like a stranger reading a contract. My name was woven through the clauses, tied not just to responsibility, but to future control. The house wasn't simply a sentimental family symbol. It was linked in writing to the money I had already spent. The document clearly stated that the asset was held in trust, and, crucially, that the trust could not be dissolved or the deed transferred without the consent of the primary financier. For the first time in my life, I treated the situation like work. I stopped being Riley the daughter and started being Riley the creditor. I took a notepad and made 2 columns. What I cannot change and what I control. I couldn't make my parents fair. I couldn't make them love me the way they loved Dylan. I couldn't make my brother grateful. But I could decide where my money went. I could decide how my name appeared on legal titles. And I could enforce the contract they signed when they were begging for help. That list led me to an attorney named Patrick O'Neill. Patrick was a recommendation from a friend. He was expensive, sharp, and had absolutely no emotional attachment to the Dawson family drama. I brought the folders to his office, set them on his mahogany desk, and laid out the sequence of events without softening it. I didn't cry. I didn't complain about my childhood. I just gave him the data. Here is the debt, I said, pointing to the start date. Here are the payments. Here is the trust agreement. And here is the fact that they are currently attempting to transfer the deed to a third party without my consent. Patrick put on his glasses and read in silence for 10 minutes. The only sound in the room was the ticking of a clock and the rustle of pages. Finally he looked up. "This isn't a gift, Ms. Dawson," he said, tapping the paper. "This is a breach of fiduciary duty. And based on this trust structure, your father doesn't actually have the authority to gift this house to anyone. Not without your signature." Hearing it framed in neutral, legal language stripped away the last bit of doubt I had been carrying. On paper, I wasn't an emotional, jealous sister overreacting to a party. I was the primary stakeholder. I was the person who had cleared a huge debt and the main beneficiary of the safeguards my parents had agreed to. "What do we do?" asked. Patrick smiled, a small, tight smile. "We stop them. We file an injunction to freeze any transfer of the deed. And we remind them who actually holds the cards." I left his office feeling lighter. But I wasn't done. I called my cousin Nina Lane. Nina works in county records and knows more about messy property disputes than she ever wanted to. She's also Uncle Edward's daughter, so she has the same no-nonsense gene. "Nina," I said, "I need to know if Dad has filed anything yet." She did some digging while we were on the phone. "He's started the process," she confirmed, her voice low. "He filed a quitclaim deed application yesterday to transfer ownership to Dylan." "Riley, it's flagged." "Flagged?" "Yeah. Because of the trust. The clerk put a hold on it because the names don't match the authority. Your dad was in here arguing with them for an hour. He thinks it's a clerical error." "It's not an error," I said. "I know," she replied. "It's a calculated risk. He thinks if he pushes hard enough or if you stay quiet long enough, the system will just let it through. He's banking on you not causing a scene." "He's going to be disappointed," I said. Later that afternoon, I stopped by our old neighbor's place. Martha Reed lives in a small bungalow right across the street from my parents. She's lived there for 30 years. She's the kind of woman who sits on her porch with iced tea and sees everything. She knows who is cheating, who is fighting, and who is broke. "Riley," she said when she saw me, wiping her hands on her apron. "I saw you at the door the other day. Didn't look like a happy visit." "It wasn't, Martha." She leaned in over the fence. "I saw the locksmith too. Came the morning after the party. Your dad looked frantic. Kept looking over his shoulder." Martha understood the subtext. She knew that when people change locks in a hurry, it's not for safety. It's for exclusion. "Keep an eye out for me, Martha." "Yes. If you see city officials or moving trucks, just let me know." "You got it, honey," she said, patting my hand. "That boy, your brother, he's been strutting around the yard like he built the place. Doesn't sit right with me. I remember who was mowing that lawn when your dad hurt his back. It wasn't him." That night, back in my apartment, I gathered the papers back into neat stacks. I slid them into fresh manila folders and labeled them with a black marker. I put them on the shelf where I could reach them easily. They didn't feel like old records anymore. They felt like ammunition. I was done waiting for my parents to suddenly develop a conscience. I was done waiting for an apology that was never coming. Whatever happened next would not depend on their goodwill. It would depend on how far I was willing to go to protect the part of this story that actually belonged to me. I looked at the useless key on the table one last time, then picked it up and dropped it into the trash can. I didn't need their key. I was about to change the locks myself. By the time the annual Dawson family summer cookout rolled around, the house had stopped feeling like a backdrop to my life and started feeling like a line someone was trying to push me behind. The gathering was held where it always was, a sprawling state park right on the edge of Lake Ontario. It was one of those humid, sticky New York summer days where the air feels heavy enough to wear. The smell of charcoal lighter fluid and grilling burgers hung thick over the picnic area, mixing with the scent of lake water and sunscreen. On the surface, it was just another Dawson gathering. Folding chairs were circled around the coolers, kids were sprinting between the trees screaming their heads off, and relatives were exchanging the same greetings they used every single July. You look good. Work is work. Can you believe how big the kids are getting? But for me, walking into that park felt like walking onto a stage where everyone else had a script, and I was the character they were trying to write out of the show. I hadn't planned on going. After the lock incident, my instinct was to barricade myself in my apartment. But Uncle Edward had called me the night before. Go, he'd said. If you don't show up, you're letting them tell the story without a rebuttal. Just be there. Stand your ground. So I went. Almost immediately, I saw that the Dylan narrative was in full swing. Every conversation seemed to bend toward my brother like gravity. He was wearing a new polo shirt, holding a beer, and looking every inch the successful heir. People were flocking to him, asking about the house, about his big move, about his plans for the next few years. I hear you're finally settling down, Dylan. Going to put in a deck. That yard needs a deck. Must be nice to have a place of your own right out of the gate. The house appeared in those talks like a prize. It was treated as a reward waiting at the end of a game he had barely played. And Dylan, he was soaking it up. He wasn't correcting anyone. He wasn't saying, well, actually, it's a family effort. He was just nodding, smiling, and saying things like, yeah, it's a great opportunity. I've got big ideas for the place. I grabbed a soda and leaned against a tree, watching my father. He was holding court near the main grill, flipping burgers with a theatrical flair. He was repeating the version of history he liked best. In that version, he was the hero who had pushed through the lean months by sheer will. He was the patriarch who had kept the lone current through sacrifice and grit. And now, he had the supreme satisfaction of seeing his son step into a secure future. We tightened our belts, I heard him tell my great-aunt Sheila. It was touch and go there for a while, Sheila, I won't lie. But we believed. We knew if we just held on, we could keep the legacy for the kids. The kids, plural. But my name didn't fit anywhere in that narrative, so he just left it out. My mother stayed close to his elbow, refilling plates and adding small comments that reinforced the image. She talked about how excited she was to see Dylan settle in, how it meant the home would stay in familiar hands. To anyone listening, it sounded like a simple, sentimental decision made by loving parents. The trust agreements, the foreclosure notices, and the 5 years of monthly wire transfers from my bank account stayed buried under the potato salad. I had not come empty-handed. Inside my canvas tote bag, resting against my sunscreen and sunglasses, was a thin manila folder. It was the same one that had sat on my kitchen table while I sorted every statement and clause. I had no specific plan to wave it around. I wasn't looking to cause a scene just for the sake of drama. But I also had no intention of letting my father's story harden into historical fact without any resistance. The breaking point came about an hour in. I was sitting at one of the weathered picnic tables with a group of relatives. My cousin Nina, Aunt Sheila, and a few others. My father and Dylan wandered over, flushed with success and heat. My dad slapped a hand on the table, looking down at us. So, he beamed. Has Dylan told you girls about the renovations he's planning? He wants to knock out that wall between the kitchen and the dining room. Open concept. Aunt Sheila clapped her hands together. Oh, that sounds wonderful. That kitchen was always so dark. Good for you, Dylan. It's a lot of responsibility, owning a home, but your dad says you're ready. Dylan shrugged, feigning modesty. Yeah, well, I've got some savings. I figure I'll start with the kitchen and see where it goes. Savings. The word rang in my ears. The only reason he had savings was because he hadn't paid rent or tuition in 6 years. It's a gift, my father added, his voice dropping to that serious, proud register. We just wanted to make sure he started on solid ground. No mortgage hanging over his head. Just a clean slate. I felt a choice appear in front of me. It was physical, like a fork in the road. I could let the story pass. I could nod along, bite my tongue, and watch the lie settle into the family history books. Everyone would go home thinking Gregory Dawson was a saint and Dylan Dawson was a self-made homeowner. Or I could introduce something that would not let the lie sit comfortably. I reached into my bag. My hand brushed the cool surface of the folder. That's interesting, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was steady enough that the chatter at the table stopped. My father looked at me, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. What is, Riley? The clean slate part, I said. And the gift part. I pulled the folder out. I didn't slam it. I just placed it gently on the picnic table, right next to the bowl of coleslaw. I opened it to a page that I had flagged with a bright yellow sticky note. It was the page that carried my name beside the terms of the trust, the section that explicitly stated no transfer of ownership could happen without the primary financier's approval. Because according to the trust documents Uncle Edward drew up, I said, looking directly at my father, the house isn't actually yours to gift, Dad. Not a loan. I watched eyes move from the paper to my father, then to Dylan, and finally back to me. In that small circle, the idea that the house had been a simple, benevolent present began to dissolve. What is that? Aunt Sheila asked, squinting at the legal text. It's the agreement Mom and Dad signed 5 years ago, I explained, keeping my tone conversational. When the bank was about to foreclose. It outlines who actually paid the mortgage for the last 60 months. And it outlines who has to sign off on any changes to the deed. I tapped my name on the paper. I haven't signed anything, Dad. So I'm confused about how Dylan is knocking down walls. The silence that followed was excruciating. It was the sound of a carefully constructed reality shattering. My father's face went purple. Riley, put that away. This isn't the place for your petty jealousy. It's not jealousy, I said. It's accuracy. You're telling everyone you gave him the house. I'm just clarifying that you can't give away what you don't fully control. Relatives who had assumed the story was straightforward started to shift in their seats. They realized there were pieces missing. Big pieces. Wait, a cousin asked, looking confused. You paid the mortgage, Riley? For 5 years, I said. Every month. My father tried to wave it off, laughing nervously. She helped out a little. We all pitched in. She's blowing it out of proportion because she's bitter. I paid $680,000, Dad, I said. That's a lot of pitching in. My mother swooped in then, practically vibrating with anxiety. Who wants cake? We brought that chocolate sheet cake everyone likes. Riley, put that away, you're upsetting your aunt. The mood never quite returned to the warmth they wanted. The cookout went on. People ate the cake, the kids kept running, but something underneath it had shifted. The smooth script was broken. I didn't stay much longer. I packed my folder back into my bag and walked to my car. As I left, I saw my father arguing in hushed, angry tones with my mother. Dylan was standing off to the side, looking less like a homeowner and more like a kid who had been caught stealing cookies. A few cousins pulled me aside on my way out. They didn't say much, just squeezed my arm or gave me a knowing look. Later that evening, short messages started appearing on my phone. I had no idea. Your dad makes it sound so different. That took guts. People who had accepted my father's version by default now understood there was more to it, even if they didn't say so directly to him. I had planted the seed of truth, and it was already growing. But my family wasn't done trying to overwrite me. A day or two later, the countermove happened. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through social media, when a video popped up in my feed. It was Dylan. He had posted a highly produced, edited video on his timeline. In it, he stood on the front lawn of the house, my house, gesturing toward the porch and the windows as if he were unveiling a finished project on an HGTV show. The sun was shining, music was swelling in the background. "So excited to start this next chapter," he said to the camera, flashing a winning smile. "Huge thanks to my parents for trusting me with the family legacy. Watch this space. Big changes coming." The caption framed it as the beginning of his life there, a symbol of how proud our parents were. I scrolled through the comments. They were pouring in from friends, distant relatives, and neighbors. "Congrats, man. You deserve it. So proud of you, Dylan. Can't wait for the housewarming." Watching it from the silence of my apartment, I felt a cold, hard resolve settle over me. I saw a public claim to a place that had already cost me more than most of them would ever know. My part in that story vanished with each heart reaction, with each congratulatory emoji. They were building a fortress of public opinion to protect their theft. I didn't respond. I didn't comment. I didn't type out a furious paragraph explaining the trust. Close the app. I turned off my phone. I looked at the folders lined up on my shelf. The evidence, the contracts, the legal ammunition. I was finished playing along. I was finished with social awkwardness at cookouts. I was finished with dropping hints. My father wanted to pretend the house was his to give. Dylan wanted to pretend the house was his to take. I picked up my phone one last time and dialed Patrick O'Neill's office. "Patrick," I said when he picked up. "The cookout didn't work. And they're publicly claiming ownership. It's time." "Time for what?" he asked, though I could hear him opening a file. "Execute the filing," I said. "And call the city. I want the locks changed back." In the days leading up to my brother's official housewarming, the day he was supposed to symbolically take possession of the kingdom, my life looked remarkably normal from the outside. I went to work. I did my laundry. I watered my plants. I bought groceries. But internally, the temperature had dropped to absolute zero. I stopped checking my phone for texts from my mother. I stopped hoping for a last-minute apology or a sudden realization on their part. I stopped playing out scenarios in the shower where my father showed up at my door in tears, begging for forgiveness. That part of me, the part that was a daughter seeking approval, had quietly packed its bags and left the building. What remained was something else entirely. I was no longer operating on emotion. I was operating on strategy. The folders on my shelf were no longer just background clutter or painful reminders of money lost. They were the boundary I intended to hold. I treated the upcoming Saturday not as a family gathering, but as a deadline for a project I was managing. On the morning of the big day, the sun came up bright and oblivious. It was perfect party weather. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching the steam rise, waiting for the first domino to fall. At 9 a.m. sharp, my phone buzzed. It was my cousin, Nina. "It's done," she said. Her voice was hushed, like she was speaking from inside a library or a church. Patrick filed the paperwork as soon as the clerk's office opened. "The lease pendens is recorded. The trust enforcement notice is live in every system that matters." "Is it visible?" "Yes." "It's blazing," she confirmed. "If anyone tries to transfer a title, notarize a deed, or even take out a home equity line of credit on that address, a giant red stop sign is going to pop up on the screen. The property is officially encumbered and under dispute. Your dad can't gift it. He can't sell it. He can't even borrow against it." I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. "Thank you, Nina. Riley," she added, pausing. "You know this is going to be loud, right?" "I know," I said. "They made it loud when they locked me out." my years of payments, my name, and the legal structures my Uncle Edward had insisted upon were now recorded in places my parents couldn't rewrite with a charming story. For the first time, the version of events I had lived through stood next to theirs in something more permanent than memory. It was etched in county records. Around 10:30 a.m., the first cracks in their perfect day started to appear. I wasn't there yet, I was waiting for the right moment, but my neighbor Martha was stationed at her front window like a war correspondent. She texted me updates. City car just pulled up. 2 people in suits. They have clipboards. Doesn't look like they're here for the dip. My parents had opened the door expecting the first wave of early guests, maybe an aunt arriving with a casserole or a friend bringing balloons. Instead, they were met by process servers and a city official. They weren't there to wish Dylan luck. They were there to serve formal notice that the property was under legal review. Because of the filing Patrick had executed, the house could not be handed over as a simple gift. The transfer of ownership my father had bragged about was legally impossible while the trust was active and a dispute was on the record. The people on the porch didn't know anything about favoritism or graduation speeches. They didn't care about my father's pride. They saw a document trail, a fiduciary obligation, and a breach of contract. Martha told me later that she saw my father's confidence physically leave his body. He stood in the doorway reading the papers, his shoulders slumping. 4 years, he had assumed his version of events was the only one that would ever matter because he was the dad, and what he said went. But the official envelope in his hand didn't care about his authority. It only cared about the law. He tried to argue, of course. Martha said she could see him gesturing, pointing at the house, pointing at Dylan. The officials just shook their heads, handed him another paper, and walked back to their car. But the universe, or perhaps just karma, wasn't done with Dylan's big day yet. Around midday, just as the actual party guests began to trickle in, a second vehicle turned onto the street. It wasn't a guest. It was a flatbed tow truck. It rumbled down the quiet suburban road, air brakes hissing, and backed up right to the edge of the driveway. You see, in his rush to play the role of the successful homeowner, Dylan had neglected a few boring details. The shiny sports sedan he drove, the lease he treated as a symbol of his smooth future, was behind on payments. 3 months behind, to be exact. Usually, my parents quietly covered the shortfalls, shifting money around to keep up appearances. But with the chaos of the party planning, the cost of the renovations they had started illegally, and the legal fees they were likely dreading, the car payment had slipped through the cracks. And there was no one left to quietly cover the difference. I wasn't there to write a check. The driver didn't knock. He didn't ask for permission. He just hopped out, hooked up the sedan and started the winch. Whir! The sound cut through the chatter of the arriving guests. People carrying gifts and 6-packs of beer stopped on the sidewalk, watching in awkward, horrified silence. My brother ran out of the house, shouting, waving his arms. Hey, put that down. What are you doing? The driver didn't even look up from his clipboard. Repossession order. Call the bank, kid. Dylan stood there, helpless, watching his car. His status symbol, being pulled up the ramp at a 45-degree angle. It was a brutal visual metaphor. The lease he couldn't afford was leaving, just like the house he couldn't afford was about to. For once, the cost of his choices landed exactly where it belonged instead of rolling downhill toward me. That was my cue. I drove over at 1 p.m. I parked 2 houses down, behind the tow truck that was just finishing strapping down my brother's car. I didn't walk up alone. Patrick O'Neill was waiting for me by his car, looking calm and sharp in a navy suit. And next to him was Uncle Edward, holding a thick folder, the original copy of the trust agreement. Walking up the path between them, I felt a strange cocktail of emotions. I was nervous. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but I also felt finished. I wasn't there to argue. I wasn't there to ask for a place at the table. I wasn't there to beg them to love me. I was there to enforce the place I already held. The front door was already open. My father was standing there, looking shell-shocked. My mother was behind him, pale and wringing her hands. Dylan was sitting on the front steps, head in his hands, defeated by the tow truck. When my father saw me, his eyes narrowed. The confusion vanished, replaced by a flash of the old anger. "Riley," he spat. "What have you done? Do you have any idea how embarrassed we are? The neighbors are watching." "I imagine they are," I said calmly. "Hello, Dad." "You did this," he said, shaking the papers the city officials had left. "You froze the title. You sent these people here to ruin your brother's day." "I didn't send them to ruin his day," I said. "I sent them to protect my investment." Patrick stepped forward before my father could explode. "Mr. Dawson," he said, his voice smooth and professional, "I'm Patrick O'Neill, representing your daughter. And I believe you know Edward." My father glared at Edward. "You're backing her on this, Ed. Against your own sister." Edward didn't flinch. "I'm backing the contract, Gregory. The one I told you to sign. The one that saved this house 5 years ago. You agreed that Riley's payments bought her a controlling interest. You don't get to pretend that didn't happen just because the mortgage is paid off." Patrick laid out the present tense in plain, undeniable language. He didn't use legal jargon that my father could wave away as mumbo-jumbo. He spoke in facts. "The trust is being enforced immediately," Patrick said. "Because you attempted to transfer the deed without the beneficiary's consent, you are in breach of the agreement. The house cannot be treated as Dylan's personal gift. The dispute is open, and until it is resolved, the property is frozen." My mother spoke up, her voice trembling. But the party. The guests are here. Dylan is supposed to move in." "That's not going to happen, Mrs. Dawson," Patrick said gently but firmly. "Actually, given the breach of fiduciary duty, we are exercising the clause that grants the financier, Riley, the right to secure the asset." He paused, letting the words hang in the hot summer air. "That means any change in control requires her consent. And she does not consent to Dylan living here." My brother looked up from the steps, his face blotchy. "So what? You're kicking me out. Have boxes inside. My bed is set up." I looked at him. Really looked at him. I saw the entitlement, but I also saw the fear. He had never had to fend for himself, and he was terrified. "You have a short window to remove your belongings," I said. My voice didn't shake. "Patrick has set the timeline. You have until the end of the weekend." "And then what?" my father demanded, stepping out onto the porch, trying to use his size to intimidate me. "You're going to throw your own parents out on the street. Is that what you've become?" "No," I said. "You and Mom can stay. For now. Under specific conditions. But Dylan goes. And the deed stays in the trust. And the locks," pointed to the door. "A locksmith is on his way to change them back. And this time I get the only key." "You can't do this," my father hissed. "It's my house." "It was your house," Edward corrected him. "Then it was the bank's house. Now." "Well, look at the paperwork, Gregory. It's the trust's house. And Riley is the trust." The guests who were still lingering on the lawn were pretending not to listen, but the silence was absolute. They heard every word. They saw the tow truck. They saw the lawyer. The narrative of the successful Dawson family had completely collapsed. "We're done here," I said. "Patrick will leave you a copy of the filing. I suggest you read it carefully." I turned to walk away, but my father shouted one last thing. "If you do this, Riley, if you walk away now, don't expect to come back for Christmas. Don't expect us to be a family." "Stop." I turned back slowly. "Dad," I said, and I felt a strange, sad smile touch my face. "I haven't been part of this family for 5 years. I was just the bank. And the bank is closed." I walked back down the path, flanked by Patrick and Edward. Behind me, I heard my mother start to cry, and my father swearing at the sky. But I didn't look back. The tow truck was pulling away with Dylan's car, and for the first time in a decade, I felt like I was driving my own life. But the war wasn't quite over. They had lost the battle for the house, but now came the battle for the exit. And they weren't going to leave quietly. The weekend following the driveway confrontation wasn't loud. There were no more screaming matches, no more speeches, and no more tow trucks. The silence that fell over the house was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. It was the sound of a balloon that had finally popped, leaving nothing but shredded rubber on the floor. Patrick had given them a deadline. Dylan's belongings had to be out by Sunday evening. My parents were told they could stay, provided they signed a formal occupancy agreement acknowledging the trust's ownership, meaning my ownership. I didn't go over there to supervise. I didn't want to gloat, and honestly, I didn't trust myself not to cry if I saw my mother packing boxes. Instead, I let Patrick handle the logistics. He was the buffer I needed, the dispassionate wall that my father couldn't shout down. By Sunday night the report came back. Dylan was out. But he wasn't the only one. My father, it turned out, possessed a level of pride that outweighed his survival instinct. When presented with the occupancy agreement, a document that would have allowed him to stay in the home he had lived in for 30 years, essentially rent-free, as long as he acknowledged my legal rights, he refused to sign. He couldn't do it. He couldn't physically bring himself to put his signature on a piece of paper that admitted his daughter was the one keeping the roof over his head. It shattered the illusion he had built his entire life around, that he was the provider, the patriarch, the one in charge. Living there as my tenant was, in his eyes, a fate worse than homelessness. So he made a choice that was foolish, financial suicide, and entirely predictable. "They're leaving too," Patrick told me over the phone on Monday morning. "Your father told me he refuses to live in a house that has been stolen from his son. He said they're finding their own place." "Stolen," I repeated, rubbing my temples. He actually used that word. He did. He's framing it as a moral stand. They're moving into a rental on the east side of town. It's significantly smaller. I felt a pang of guilt, that old reflex kicking in, but I squashed it. I hadn't kicked them out. I had offered them a lifeboat. They were the ones who decided the lifeboat wasn't fancy enough and chose to jump back into the ocean. In the weeks that followed, reality set in like a cold front. My parents moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a complex that had seen better days. It was a stark drop from the house with the wraparound porch and the big backyard. For the first time in decades, my father had to deal with a landlord who didn't care about his stories or his past glories. If the sink broke, he couldn't just fix it and brag about it. He had to put in a maintenance request like everyone else. The community standing he cherished so much evaporated. You can't host the neighborhood cookout on a balcony that barely fits 2 chairs. You can't play the benevolent patriarch when you're arguing with property management about parking spots. My mother, I heard through the grapevine, was struggling with the adjustment. She had spent her life curating that house, filling it with memories and clutter. Now, she was in a box with beige walls she wasn't allowed to paint. But even then, she stuck to the script. She told people they had downsized because the big house was just too much work, and they wanted a simpler life. She never mentioned the trust. She never mentioned me. And then there was Dylan. My brother's landing was even rougher. Without the free house and the fully stocked fridge, and without a car since he still couldn't make the payments to get it out of impound, he was forced to grow up at warp speed. He ended up sharing a crampy 3-bedroom apartment near the university with 2 guys he barely knew. These weren't family members who thought the sun rose and set on his head. These were guys who worked construction and retail, guys who paid their own bills and had zero patience for a prince without a kingdom. I ran into one of his roommates, a guy named Marcus, at the grocery store a few weeks later. We had gone to high school together, vaguely. "Riley, right?" Marcus asked, tossing a bag of frozen peas into his cart. "You're Dylan's sister." "Yeah," I said, tensing up, waiting for the accusation. Instead, Marcus laughed. "Man, your brother is something else. He tried to leave his dishes in the sink for 3 days last week. Told us he was stressed about his career. I told him I didn't care if he was the CEO of Apple. If he didn't wash the skillet, I was putting it in his bed. I couldn't help it. I laughed. A genuine belly-deep laugh. How'd he handle that? Yes. He washed the skillet, Marcus said. He's learning. Slowly. But he's realizing that nobody out here cares about his potential. We just care if he pays the rent on the first. It was the best thing that could have happened to him. For the first time in his life, Dylan was in an environment where he was judged by his actions, not his promises. The safety net was gone, and he was finally feeling the pavement under his feet. Meanwhile, I had a house to deal with. A month after they moved out, I went back to the property on the quiet street. I brought Uncle Edward with me this time, mostly for moral support, but also because he had a practical eye for real estate. The house was empty. Walking through the front door was a surreal experience. The air smelled stale, a mix of dust and the faint, lingering scent of my mother's lavender air freshener. They had taken almost everything. Furniture, curtains, pictures. The walls were left with pale squares where frames had hung for 20 years. It didn't feel like my childhood home anymore. Felt like a shell. I walked into the kitchen, the place where I had imagined that celebratory dinner happening. The place where I thought we would toast to the mortgage being paid off. It was just a room with linoleum floors and outdated cabinets. There was no magic here. There were no ghosts. It was just wood, glass, and drywall. It's got good bones, Edward said, tapping a knuckle against a support beam. Needs work, though. Your dad let a lot of maintenance slide the last few years while he was tightening his belt. Yeah, I said, running my hand along the counter. He did. I walked up the stairs to my old bedroom. It was smaller than I remembered. The window looked out over the backyard, where the grass was already getting a little too long. I thought about the girl who used to sit on that bed, calculating budgets on a laptop, terrified that her parents would lose everything. I thought about the years of anxiety, the skipped vacations, the cheap noodles. I felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness over the space. Not because I wanted to live there. God no, too many bad memories, but because I had bought it. Had saved it. It was the physical manifestation of my competence. So, Edward said, leaning in the doorway. What's the plan? You moving in? I looked around the empty room. No. I have an apartment. Have a life. And honestly, living here would feel like moving backward. Sell it, he suggested. Market is hot. You could cash out, take that $680 back plus appreciation. Walk away with a nice check. It was the logical move. Sell it, take the money, and never look back. Wash my hands of the Dawson legacy forever. But something about that felt like a defeat. It felt like admitting that the last 5 years were just a waste, a sunk cost that I needed to liquidate. I don't think I want to sell it yet, I said slowly. I think I want it to work for me. For once. I walked back downstairs and stood in the living room, the spot where my father had given his big speech about Dylan's gift. I want to rent it, I told Edward. But not to family. I want to fix it up, really fix it, not just patch it. New floors, new paint. Fix that wall Dylan wanted to knock down. And then I want to put a tenant in here who pays market rate. A family who actually appreciates the roof over their heads. Edward smiled, a genuine, crinkly-eyed smile. That sounds like a business plan, Riley. It is, I said. It's an asset. That's what you told me, right? It's not an heirloom. It's an asset. Exactly. In that moment, the house stopped being a symbol of my rejection and started being a tool for my future. I wasn't the ungrateful daughter anymore. I was the landlord. I was the investor. I spent the next 2 months pouring sweat equity into the place. This time I didn't mind the work. I went over on weekends, not to visit people who ignored me, but to rip up old carpet and paint over the beige walls with crisp, clean white. I hired contractors for the big stuff, plumbing, electrical, and I paid them with the money I was no longer sending to the mortgage company. It was therapeutic. Every layer of wallpaper I scraped off felt like I was scraping off a layer of their narrative. I was erasing the Dawson family home and turning it into Property A. During this time, the silence from my family was mostly maintained, but there were cracks. I got a few texts from my mother. They were masterpieces of passive aggression. Hope you're happy. Dad's back is hurting from the move. Dylan says his apartment has cockroaches. Just thought you should know. I didn't reply to the guilt trips. I simply sent back thumbs up emojis or, if I was feeling particularly petty, a link to a local exterminator. I was done absorbing their pain. I was done being the sponge that soaked up the consequences of their bad decisions. One afternoon, while I was painting the front porch trim, Martha came over from across the street. She was holding a pitcher of lemonade. "You're doing a good job, honey," she said, pouring me a glass. "Place hasn't looked this bright in 10 years. "Thanks, Martha," I said, wiping sweat from my forehead. "You know," she said, looking down the street toward the east side of town. "Your dad drove by yesterday. Slowed down. Looked at the house." "Did he?" "Yeah. He looked like a man who realizes he bet on the wrong horse." I took a sip of the lemonade. It was tart and cold and perfect. "He didn't bet on a horse, Martha," I said. "He bet against me. He bet that I would always be the quiet, obedient little girl who paid the bills and sat in the corner. He forgot that I'm the one who learned how to do the math." Martha laughed. "Well, the math looks good from where I'm standing." By the time the leaves started to turn orange again, marking 1 full year since I had paid off the mortgage, the house was ready. It was beautiful. It was empty. And it was mine. I listed it with a property management company because I didn't want to deal with tenants personally. Within a week, we had a signed lease. A young couple with a baby on the way. They had good credit, stable jobs, and they loved the yard. Signing that lease felt better than any thank you my parents could have ever given me. It was a contract based on mutual respect and clear terms. No emotional blackmail. No hidden agendas. Just value for value. I was finally free. Or so I thought. But family is a complicated thing. Just when you think you've built a wall high enough to keep the drama out, you realize that some people are willing to tunnel underneath it. The holidays were approaching. And in the Dawson family, Christmas was never just a holiday. It was a weapon. In the Dawson family playbook, December wasn't about peace on earth or goodwill toward men. It was about leverage. For as long as I could remember, the holidays served as a mandatory amnesty period. It didn't matter what had been said in July, or who had stolen money in October, or which emotional lines had been crossed in November. Once the calendar hit December 1st, we were all expected to suffer from collective amnesia. If you were still holding a grudge when the tree went up, you were the problem. You were the Grinch stealing the family's joy. I knew the campaign was coming. I could feel it in the air like the drop in barometric pressure before a snowstorm. It started with what therapists like to call the flying monkeys. In The Wizard of Oz, the wicked witch sends out her flying monkeys to do her dirty work. In Toxic Family Dynamics, the narcissist sends out well-meaning relatives to guilt-trip the victim back into the fold. My Aunt Sheila was the squadron leader. Sheila is a sweet woman. She bakes excellent cookies and remembers everyone's birthday. But she also values keeping the peace over telling the truth. She called me on a Tuesday evening in early December. "Riley, honey," she started, her voice dripping with sugary concern. "I'm just calling to get a head count for Christmas Eve dinner. I'm hosting this year since your parents are in the apartment and it's a bit tight for them." She paused, waiting for me to jump in and smooth over the awkwardness. I didn't. "That sounds nice, Aunt Sheila," I said. "But I won't be making it this year." The silence on the other end was heavy. "Oh, really? Are you sure? Your mother was really hoping to see you. She's been crying, you know. She says it just doesn't feel like Christmas without the whole family." "I'm sure she is upset," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "But I have other plans. It's just..." Sheila lowered her voice, as if sharing a state secret. "Your dad is having a hard time. His pride is hurt. If you just came for an hour, just to show your face, I think it would go a long way toward healing things. Be the bigger person, Riley. It's Christmas. There it was. Be the bigger person. I had been the bigger person since I was 16 years old. I had been the bigger person when I paid the bills. I had been the bigger person when I stepped aside for Dylan. Being the bigger person is usually code for be the person willing to take the hit so the rest of us don't have to deal with the conflict. I love you, Aunt Sheila, I said firmly. But my answer is no. I'm not healing anything by pretending the last 6 months didn't happen. I hope you have a lovely dinner. I hung up before she could play the "Grandma would have wanted you there" card. The second wave of the assault came from the source itself. A week before Christmas, I came home from work to find a Tupperware container sitting on my doorstep. It was filled with my mother's signature peppermint bark. Taped to the lid was a card. I brought it inside, leaving it on the counter while I took off my coat. The plastic container stared at me. It was a weaponized confection. It was a reminder of the good times, a sensory trigger designed to bypass my logic and hit me right in the nostalgia. I opened the card. It wasn't an apology. It was a guilt trip written in cursive. Riley, I made these for you. I know you're busy with your new life, but I hope you have time to remember your family. We are all struggling. Dylan is having a hard time. Your father is depressed. We need our family together. Please come home. Mom. Note the phrasing. Your new life. As if my independence was a hobby I had picked up like knitting. And we are struggling. Not we are sorry. Not we understand why you're hurt. Just a list of their pain, presented as my responsibility to fix. I looked at the peppermint bark. I love that stuff, but eating it felt like accepting a bribe. I threw it in the trash. It was a small act, maybe even a wasteful one, but it felt necessary. I wasn't going to consume their guilt anymore. The real test came on Christmas Eve. For 34 years, Christmas Eve followed a strict script. We went to Mass, we ate ham, we opened one gift, and we listened to my father tell stories about how great the year had been, even when it hadn't. This year my apartment was quiet. I had decorated a small real tree in the corner with white lights, but there was no pile of gifts. There was no chaos. I had decided to start my own tradition. I called it Peace on Earth, Goodwill Toward Riley. I ordered a large pizza with toppings my father hated, anchovies and jalapenos. I poured a glass of expensive red wine, the kind I used to skip buying so I could afford their mortgage. I put on Die Hard, the best Christmas movie, and I will fight anyone on this. And I sat on my couch in my pajamas. Around 7 p.m. my phone started buzzing. Group text. Merry Christmas. Miss you guys. From a cousin in Ohio. Look at the ham. From Uncle Bob. Then a picture from Aunt Sheila's house. It was a wide shot of the living room. My parents were there on the couch. My dad looked older, his face drawn and sour. He was holding a drink and looking at the floor. My mom looked anxious, her smile tight and forced. And there was Dylan. He looked different. He was thinner. He wasn't wearing the new clothes he usually sported. He was wearing a flannel shirt I recognized from 3 years ago. He looked uncomfortable, sitting on the edge of a folding chair, looking at his phone. The caption read, "Family is everything. Missing our Riley tonight." I zoomed in on the photo. I looked at the tension in the room. I realized that if I were there, I would be the buffer. I would be the one refilling drinks, making jokes to diffuse my dad's temper, steering the conversation away from Dylan's failures. I would be the shock absorber. Without me, the ride was bumpy. They were having to sit in the raw, unfiltered reality of their dynamic. I put the phone down, took a bite of my spicy, salty pizza, and felt a wave of peace so profound it almost made me cry. I wasn't lonely. I was safe. Few hours later, my phone buzzed again. Single text. It wasn't from my mom or dad. It was from Dylan. I stared at the name on the screen. We hadn't spoken since the tow truck incident. Hey, it's weird here without you. Dad is on a rampage about the government or something. Mom is crying in the kitchen. I don't know. Merry Christmas. I read it 3 times. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a "you were right," but it was an acknowledgement. For the first time, he wasn't parroting my parents. He was reporting from the front lines, and he sounded tired. He was finally seeing the chaos for what it was because I wasn't there to filter it for him. I debated answering. Part of me wanted to say, "I told you so." Part of me wanted to say, "Get out while you can." Instead, I typed back, "Merry Christmas, Dylan. Good luck." I put the phone on Do Not Disturb and finished my movie. The next morning, Christmas Day, I drove over to the rental property. Not to spy, but to check the mailbox and shovel the sidewalk. Landlord duties don't stop for holidays. The house looked beautiful. My new tenants, the Millers, had put a wreath on the door, a tasteful one with real pine cones. There were warm lights in the windows. As I was salting the walkway, the front door opened. Mark Miller stepped out, holding a mug of coffee. "Riley," he called out. "Merry Christmas. You didn't have to come out here, I was going to get the shovel." "It's okay, Mark," I smiled. I needed the fresh air. "How's the heating holding up?" "It's perfect," he said. "Listen, Sarah and I got you something. Just a small thank you." He handed me a card and a small gift bag. Inside was a bottle of wine and a gift card to the local hardware store. "We really appreciate everything you did with the place," Mark said earnestly. "Fixing that draft in the nursery means a lot to us. We're really happy here." "I'm glad," I said, and I meant it. I sat in my car afterwards and looked at the card. "To the best landlord ever. Thanks for making this a real home for us. Mark and Sarah." The contrast was jarring. My own family, the people who shared my DNA, treated me like an unending resource to be mined until I was empty. They felt entitled to my money, my time, and my submission. When I stopped giving, they attacked. These strangers. I provided a service. They paid me a fair price. And they treated me with gratitude and respect. It reinforced everything I had done. The house wasn't just a building. It was a lesson. It taught me that relationships, whether business or personal, need to be reciprocal. If energy only flows one way, it's not a relationship. It's a robbery. I drove away from the house feeling lighter than I had in years. I had survived the holidays. I hadn't caved. I hadn't eaten the guilt trip peppermint bark. But as January rolled around, the silence from the East Side rental, as I called my parents' place in my head, started to shift again. The anger and the freezing out hadn't worked. The guilt trips hadn't worked. So naturally they tried the only tactic they had left. They tried to bargain. It started with a call from my Uncle Edward. "Riley," he said, his voice businesslike but weary. "I just got off the phone with your father. We need to have a meeting." "What kind of meeting?" I asked, instantly on guard. "A financial one," Edward said. "He's in trouble, Riley. Real trouble. And since you control the trust, he can't fix it without you." I felt a tightening in my chest. "What did he do?" "He tried to invest," Edward sighed. "A sure thing to make back the money he feels he lost on the house. To prove he's still the provider. It didn't go well." Closed my eyes. Course. The pride. The need to be the big man. It was a bottomless pit. "How bad is it?" "Yes. Bad enough that he's asking to borrow against the equity in the house," Edward said. "He wants you to sign off on a HELOC, a home equity line of credit. He says he'll pay you back with interest." I almost laughed. It was tragic, really. He was asking to borrow money against the house I paid for, the house I saved, the house he tried to steal, so he could fix a mess he made. "He wants a meeting." "Yes." "He's demanding one," Edward corrected. "But I think you should take it. Not to give him the money, but to finish this." "Finish it how?" "By closing the loop," Edward said. "He still thinks this is a negotiation. He still thinks he has leverage because he's your father. You need to show him the balance sheet." I looked at my calendar. I looked at the peace on earth text I had sent myself on Christmas. "Okay," I said. "Set it up. But not at their apartment. And not at your office. Where then? At the house, I said. My house. The rental. The tenants are out of town for the weekend. I want him to stand in the living room he tried to give away and ask me for money. It was petty. I admit it. But after 5 years of being invisible, I wanted to be seen. I wanted him to see exactly who held the keys. And I had a feeling that this meeting wasn't going to end with a check. It was going to end with a final severance. The meeting was set for Saturday morning. The sky was a bruised shade of gray, threatening snow, which felt appropriate for the mood. My tenants, the Millers, were visiting in-laws in Vermont for the weekend and had graciously given me permission to check the furnace, which was my cover story for using the space. I arrived an hour early. I wanted to own the room before they even stepped foot in it. Walking into the house felt different this time. It wasn't the empty shell I had renovated, nor was it the ghost-filled home of my childhood. It was someone else's home now. There were baby toys stacked neatly in the corner of the living room. A throw blanket was draped over the sofa. The air smelled of coffee and cinnamon, not tension. It was a space of peace, and I was about to invite a hurricane into it. I set up at the dining room table, the same spot where I had once placed the foreclosure notices in front of my father 5 years ago. I laid out a single notepad and a pen. No refreshments. This wasn't a social call. Uncle Edward arrived first. He looked tired. He shook the snow off his coat and gave me a grim nod. "You ready for this?" he asked, pulling out a chair. "I've been ready for 5 years," I said. "I just didn't know it." "He's agitated," Edward warned. "He's convinced this is a formality. In his head, it's still family money. He thinks you just need to be talked down from your tantrum." "He's in for a long morning," I said. At 10 a.m., a car pulled into the driveway. It wasn't the big truck my father used to drive, that had been sold months ago to cover rent. It was a beat-up sedan. My parents got out. My mother looked smaller, huddled inside a coat that looked a little too big for her. My father, however, walked with a strange, aggressive energy. He marched up the walk, looking at the house not with nostalgia, but with a critical, possessive glare. He was scanning the gutters, the windows, checking for flaws he could point out. They let themselves in, I hadn't locked the door, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Well," my father said, not saying hello. He looked around the Millers' living room. They changed the paint color. I liked the yellow. "It's agreeable gray," I said from the table. "Tenants prefer neutral tones. Have a seat." My father bristled at the command but sat down. My mother hovered by his shoulder, refusing to sit, clutching her purse like a shield. "Let's cut the chase, Riley," my father said, leaning forward. He placed his heavy hands on the table. "Edward says you're being difficult about the signature." "I'm not being difficult," I said calmly. "I'm being informed. Edward tells me you want to open a home equity line of credit against this property. $50,000. It's a bridge loan," he corrected quickly. "Temporary. I have an opportunity. A supplier I used to know. He's got a line on some high-end diagnostic equipment. Pennies on the dollar. I buy it, I flip it to the dealerships in the city. I triple the money in 60 days. I looked at him. I saw the desperation behind his eyes. This wasn't a business plan. It was a gamble. He was trying to claw back his status as the businessman of the family with one big score. "And why do you need the house?" he asked. "Why not a business loan?" "Because the banks are tight right now," he scoffed. "Red tape. They don't understand the industry. But the equity is sitting right here. It's our equity. It's just sitting in the walls doing nothing." "It's not doing nothing," I said. "It's appreciating. And it's securing the asset." "Riley, don't lecture me on assets," he snapped. "I bought this house 30 years ago. And you lost it 5 years ago," I said. The silence that followed was sharp. My mother gasped softly. My father's face reddened. "I didn't lose it," he hissed. "We hit a rough patch. I managed it. No, Dad, I said, keeping my voice steady. I managed it. Paid the bills. I stopped the foreclosure. And now, you want to risk the very thing I saved so you can play stock market with auto parts. You want me to put a lien on my property so you can gamble. It's not gambling, he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. The baby toys in the corner seemed to vibrate. It's business. And it's not your property. It's the family home. Your name is on the paper for tax reasons. Edward told you to do that. He spun toward Edward. Tell her, Ed. Tell her it's just paper. Edward didn't move. He kept his hands folded. I told her to sign the trust because she was paying the mortgage, Gregory. It wasn't for taxes. It was for ownership. She owns the house. We've been over this. My father looked between us, the walls closing in. The reality he had constructed, the one where he was the benevolent king and I was the helpful subject, was dissolving. So that's it, he sneered at me. You're going to let your father go under. Over 50 grand. You have a tenant paying rent. You're making money off my back. I'm making money off my investment, I corrected. And I'm not letting you go under. You have an apartment. You have a pension. You have food. What you don't have is play money. And I am not going to jeopardize my financial future to fund your ego. My ego. He stood up, knocking the chair back. I raised you. I put food on this table. And I paid for the table. I stood up too. I paid for the roof. I paid for the floor you're standing on. For 5 years, I ate ramen noodles while you played the big shot. I drove a car with no heat while you leased a sports car for Dylan. I'm done, Dad. I am done paying for your pride. My mother finally spoke. Her voice was thin, trembling. Riley, please. He's embarrassed. Just help him this one time. He promises he'll pay it back. I looked at her. I saw the woman who had spent her life smoothing things over, enabling his delusions because it was easier than facing the truth. He can't pay it back, Mom, I said gently. If this deal goes south, and it will, the bank takes the house. My house. And then where am I? I lose everything I worked for. Why is my safety less important than his gamble? She didn't have an answer. She just looked down at her shoes. My father was pacing now, breathing hard. You're ungrateful, he muttered. Cold. I don't know where you came from. You're not a Dawson. Maybe not, I said. Because Dawsons apparently drive off cliffs and expect other people to catch them. I'm the one who built the bridge. Picked up the notepad. I ripped off the top sheet where I had written a single word. No. The answer is no, I said. No HELOC. No loan. No access to the equity. The trust stands. My father stared at me with pure hatred. It wasn't the anger of a parent disciplining a child. It was the rage of a man who realizes he has lost power over a woman. Then you're dead to me, he said. The words were quiet, precise. You keep the damn house. Keep the money. But don't call us. Don't come by. If you're not family, then stay away. Gregory! My mother cried out, grabbing his arm. No, Angela. He shook her off. She made her choice. She chose the money over her father. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, but I didn't wipe it away. I didn't choose the money, Dad. Chose myself. I chose not to be your victim anymore. He didn't respond. He turned and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the knob I had installed, and looked back one last time. I hope it's worth it, he said. I hope the house keeps you warm at night. Then he walked out. My mother looked at me, her eyes full of tears, torn between her husband and her daughter. Mom, I said softly. You can call me. Anytime. But I won't give him money. She nodded, a jerky, broken motion, and then hurried after him. The door clicked shut. The silence rushed back in. The baby toys were still in the corner. The throw blanket was still on the couch. The world hadn't ended. The roof hadn't collapsed. I sat back down in the chair, my legs suddenly feeling like jelly. Uncle Edward let out a long, slow exhale. Well, he said. That was inevitable. Did I do the right thing? Asked, my voice shaking. He said I'm dead to him. Edward reached across the table and put his hand over mine. His hand was rough, calloused, warm. He's a drowning man, Riley. He's trying to climb on top of you to breathe. If you let him, you both drown. You didn't kill the relationship. You just refused to be the sacrifice. He stood up. I'm proud of you. Your grandfather would have been proud of you. You protected the legacy. The real legacy, which is survival. We left the house 10 minutes later. I locked the door, checking it twice. As I drove away, I saw their car was already gone. There were no tracks in the fresh snow except mine. I went back to my apartment and did something strange. Cleaned. I scrubbed the bathroom, I vacuumed the rugs, I organized the pantry. I needed to move to burn off the adrenaline. By evening, the apartment was spotless. I ordered Thai food and sat by the window, watching the snow finally start to fall in earnest. My phone was silent. No texts from my mother. No angry voicemails from my father. Hurt. I won't lie and say it didn't hurt. There is a primal part of us that wants our parents to love us, to see us, to value us. To have that severed is a wound that bleeds for a long time. But underneath the pain, there was a foundation of steel. I wasn't worrying about a foreclosure notice. I wasn't worrying about a bank calling me. I wasn't worrying about whether I could afford my rent because I had given all my money to a black hole. I was safe. And then, around 9 p.m., a notification popped up on my phone. It wasn't a text. It was an email. From Dylan. Subject: I heard. My stomach tightened. I expected a rant. I expected him to defend Dad, to call me a monster. Opened it. Riley. Dad came by the apartment. He's pretty bad. Screaming about how you stole his life. He tried to get me to call you and scream at you too. I didn't do it. I just wanted to say, get it. I've been paying my own rent for 4 months now. Sucks. It's hard. I missed a payment on my credit card and got hit with a late fee, and I almost threw up. I realized that's what you did for 5 years. You took the stress for all of us. I'm sorry I didn't say thank you. I'm sorry I acted like I deserved the house. I didn't earn it. You did. I probably can't talk to you for a while because Mom and Dad are watching me like a hawk, but yeah, you're not the bad guy, Riley. Dylan. I read the email until the screen blurred. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't a happy ending with a group hug. But it was the truth. And coming from the brother who had been trained since birth to be entitled, it was a miracle. My father was gone. He had chosen his pride over his daughter. But my brother was waking up. The house had torn us apart, but the reality of the world, the cold, hard math of life, was starting to stitch something new together. Closed my laptop. The snow was piling up outside, covering everything in a clean white blanket. I was alone. But for the first time I wasn't lonely. I was just free. It has been 18 months since the day my father walked out of the rental house and told me I was dead to him. 18 months since I watched his car disappear into the snow, leaving only tire tracks and a silence that felt heavier than the winter sky. In movies, this is the part where there's a montage. You see the protagonist getting a makeover, buying a new wardrobe, and laughing with friends while upbeat music plays. The reality of estrangement, or low contact, which is the clinical term for what I have with my parents, is quieter than that. It's less of a party and more of a slow, steady exhale after holding your breath for a decade. The first thing I noticed was the phantom limb syndrome of my bank account. For 5 years, I had been conditioned to panic on the first of the month. My body would physically tense up. I'd wake up sweating, checking my balance, calculating if the transfer to the mortgage company would leave me enough for gas. The first month after the no, when the first rolled around, the money stayed. Just sat there in my account. Digital numbers that didn't disappear. I remember staring at my banking app at 7 a.m., waiting for the drain, and realizing the plug was finally in place. That money was mine. It wasn't spoken for. It wasn't already spent on a roof I wasn't allowed to sleep under. I didn't go crazy. I didn't buy a yacht. I did something that felt infinitely more rebellious. I bought a car. Not a used beater. Not a sedan with a check engine light that I covered with electrical tape. I went to a dealership and bought a sensible, reliable SUV with heated seats and a warranty. Driving it off the lot felt like flying. Every time I turned on those heated seats in the middle of February, I felt a petty, warm thrill of victory. This is what self-respect feels like, I thought. Feels like lumbar support. The house, the physical object at the center of the war, became the most boring part of my life, which is exactly what an investment should be. The Millers are still there. They pay their rent on the 28th of every month like clockwork. The money goes into a separate account. Covers the taxes, the insurance, and the repairs. The surplus. That goes into my retirement fund. The asset that was supposed to act as a tomb for my finances has become the engine of my future. I drive by occasionally and I see the lights on and I feel nothing. No anger. No longing. It's just wood and brick. It's just property, eh? But you're not here to hear about my diversified portfolio. You want to know about the people. The silence from the East Side rental held for a long time. My father is a stubborn man, and he committed to the bit. He told relatives that I had abandoned them, that I had changed. That big city life I lived 20 minutes away had made me cold. I let him tell that story. I stopped correcting the record. One of the hardest lessons I learned is that you cannot control the version of you that exists in other people's heads. If he needs me to be the villain to justify his own narrative, then let me be the villain. I'd rather be the villain in his story than a doormat in my own. My mother is a different story. About 6 months ago, the no-contact wall developed a small door. She started texting me again. Not guilt trips this time. Just small, tentative updates. Saw a bird feeder I thought you'd like. Your cousin had her baby. I respond. Keep it light. Keep it distant. We're not best friends. We don't have Sunday dinners. But we have a polite, carefully managed connection. She knows the boundary now. She knows that if she asks for money, or if she tries to deliver a message from Dad about how I need to apologize, the door closes. So she doesn't knock on that part of the wall anymore. It's a sad, diminished version of a mother-daughter relationship, but it's safe. And right now, safety is more important to me than intimacy. And then there's Dylan. The email he sent me that snowy night wasn't a fluke. It was the beginning of a very slow, very awkward truce. We met for lunch about 3 months after the blowout. We picked a diner halfway between my apartment and his place. Neutral ground. When he walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked tired. He was wearing work boots that were actually scuffed with dirt, not fashionably distressed. He had dark circles under his eyes. He slid into the booth and ordered a black coffee. No whipped cream, no caramel drizzle. Just fuel. So, he said, fiddling with a sugar packet. I got promoted. Yeah. Yes. Where? The warehouse, he said. I'm a shift supervisor now. It's a lot of paperwork. Dealing with guys calling out sick. It's annoying. I laughed. Welcome to management. He looked up at me, and for a second the old Dylan, the defensive, entitled kid, flashed in his eyes. But then he sighed and let it go. Dad is still waiting, you know, he said quietly. He thinks you're going to break. He thinks you're going to show up with a check and beg for forgiveness. He's going to be waiting a long time, I said. I know, Dylan said. He took a sip of his coffee. I tried to explain it to him. I told him, Dad, she paid for the house. It's hers. He can't hear it. It's like his brain rewires the facts as soon as I say them. It's survival, I told him. If he admits I'm right, he has to admit he failed. He can't do that. Dylan nodded. Yeah, well, I'm done listening to it. I moved out of the place with the guys. Got my own studio. It's the size of a shoebox and it smells like old soup, but pay for it. Nobody can kick me out. I reached across the table and put my hand on his arm. That's the best feeling in the world, Dylan. Nobody can kick you out. We aren't best friends. We don't text every day. But we are siblings again. We are two people who survived the same shipwreck and washed up on different shores, waving at each other from a distance. He respects me now, not because I'm his sister, but because I was the first person to tell him no and stick to it. I think in a weird way I saved him too. I saved him from becoming a carbon copy of our father. Looking back on this entire saga, the envelopes in the drawer, the party, the tow truck, the lock change, I realized the turning point wasn't a single event. It wasn't the moment the mortgage hit zero. The turning point was the moment I stopped volunteering to disappear so everyone else could stay comfortable. We are taught, especially as women, that love is synonymous with sacrifice. We are taught that being a good family member means absorbing the shock, filling the gaps, and setting ourselves on fire to keep others warm. We are told that boundaries are selfish and that saying, "This is mine," is an act of aggression. Paying off that mortgage showed me how easily love can be weaponized to excuse-taking. Taking control of what I built showed me that love without respect is not a relationship. It's a hostage situation. I used to think that if I just paid enough, if I just gave enough, I could buy my way into their approval. I thought the receipt for the mortgage would double as a receipt for their love. But you can't buy what isn't for sale. And you shouldn't have to buy what should be freely given. My father calls me selfish. He tells the neighbors I'm greedy. Let him. If selfish means securing my future, protecting my peace, and refusing to be an endless resource for people who won't even say thank you, then I will wear that label like a badge of honor. I sit on my balcony now, in the apartment that I pay for, driving the car that I bought, with a bank account that belongs only to me. I drink my coffee in the morning and I don't worry about foreclosures. I don't worry about pleasing Gregory Dawson. I think about that girl sitting on the edge of her bed 5 years ago, terrified and holding a stack of red letters. I wish I could go back and tell her that she's going to make it. I wish I could tell her that the house doesn't matter, but she matters. If there is anything I want you to take away from my story, it is this. You do not owe your family your destruction. You do not owe them your financial future. And you certainly do not owe them your silence. Choosing yourself is not harm. Walking away from a toxicity that shares your last name is not a failure. Sometimes it is the first truthful, healthy thing you do for both your family and yourself. It breaks the cycle. It forces everyone to stand on their own 2 feet. Some people will fall when you stop holding them up. That is not your fault. That is gravity. My name is Riley Dawson. I'm 36 years old. I own a house I don't live in, I have a family I rarely see. And for the first time in my entire life, I am completely, wonderfully free. And let me tell you, the view from here is spectacular. Thank you for listening to my story. I know this was a long one, and I know it wasn't exactly a fairy tale ending. But it was a real ending. If you made it this far, do me a favor. Go to the comments and tell me. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with your family? Have you ever had to be the villain to save yourself? I read every single comment, and your stories remind me that I'm not alone in this. If you enjoyed this video, or if it hit a little too close to home, please hit that like button. It really does help the channel grow. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider it. We talk about the messy, complicated, real stuff here. Take care of yourselves and remember, don't set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. See you in the next one.